why the narcissist cannot recover after betraying a super empath. And before we go anywhere, you need to understand what I mean by cannot, because that word is carrying a lot of weight in this title, and it deserves to be unpacked before we build anything on top of it. I do not mean cannot the way a person cannot lift something too heavy or cannot solve a puzzle they lack the tools for. I mean cannot the way a person cannot unknow something they have seen, cannot unfeel something that has already landed, cannot return to a version of themselves that existed before a particular encounter, change their internal landscape permanently and without their permission. The narcissist who betrays a super empath does not walk away clean, does not move on the way they have moved on from everyone else, does not find the next person and slot seamlessly back into the pattern that has always worked before. Something happens in the aftermath of this particular betrayal that the narcissist never saw coming and cannot fully explain. And that something is what this entire episode is about. So, if you have ever been a super empath on the receiving end of a narcissist's worst behavior and watched them apparently sail off into the sunset completely unaffected, stay with me. Because what is actually happening underneath that surface is one of the most psychologically fascinating, most quietly devastating processes in all of relationship dynamics. And the narcissist is desperately hoping you never discover it. Let us start with the super empath, because you cannot understand what the narcissist loses without first understanding what a super empath actually is. Not in the vague, widely used way the word gets thrown around, but specifically and precisely in a way that explains why this particular person represents something categorically different from every other target a narcissist has ever chosen. A super empath is not simply someone who is very empathetic. Every empath feels deeply. What separates the super empath is not the depth of feeling alone, but the combination of that depth with something the narcissist never anticipated encountering in someone they chose, a spine, a self-awareness that runs as deep as the empathy itself, an ability to absorb, understand, and feel the full weight of another person's psychology, including their darkness, their manipulation, their carefully constructed false self, and to hold all of that clearly, accurately, and without losing themselves in it indefinitely. The super empath is not someone who never gets hurt. They get hurt profoundly, perhaps more profoundly than most, because of how completely they feel everything. But they possess a capacity for reckoning that eventually always catches up with what was done to them. And when it does, when the super empath's perception finally fully crystallizes around what the narcissist actually is, what was actually happening, what was real, and what was constructed, the quality of that seeing is unlike anything the narcissist has been seen with before. It is complete, it is accurate, it has no sentimentality left in it, and it lands on the narcissist in a way that nothing else in their life ever has. Here is what the narcissist understood about every previous relationship they have had, consciously or not. Most people, when they are hurt by a narcissist, leave with their perception of the narcissist still somewhat intact. They leave confused. They leave with some version of the relationship mythology still running. The idea that somewhere underneath everything that went wrong, there was something genuine, something worth the pain, some real version of the person they fell in love with, that the circumstances just did not allow to fully emerge. They leave with enough uncertainty about what actually happened that the narcissist retains the ability to rewrite the story, to be the victim of the ending rather than the architect of the damage, to construct a narrative in the circles that matter to them where the person who left was flawed or unstable or simply not the right fit. This rewriting is not a small thing for a narcissist. It is essential. The ability to control the narrative around every ending, to never be the unambiguous villain of any story, to always have a version of events that protects the self-image they cannot survive without. This is how narcissists move through their relational history without accumulating the kind of accountability that would force genuine change. Every ending that can be spun is an ending that costs them nothing at the psychological level that matters most. But here is the thing, and you are going to want to pay close attention to this next part because this is where everything shifts. The super empath does not leave this way. When a super empath finally reaches the end of their capacity for a narcissistic relationship, and it is always a process, never a sudden snap, always the result of a slow and thorough accumulation of evidence that the person they are with is not capable of what the relationship requires, what they take with them on the way out is not confusion. It is clarity, a specific, comprehensive, unflattering clarity about exactly what the narcissist is, exactly how the manipulation worked, exactly which moments were genuine and which were performed, exactly what they were chosen for, and exactly how they were used. This clarity is built from the same perceptive apparatus that made the super empath so appealing to the narcissist in the first place. The ability to read people at depth, to understand motivations beneath the surface presentation, to track patterns across time with an accuracy most people never develop. The narcissist spent the relationship benefiting from being understood so well. They did not anticipate that the same understanding would eventually turn itself toward the full picture of what they actually did and produce a verdict that left no room for revision. And this verdict, this quiet, devastatingly accurate, completely unsentimental understanding of exactly who the narcissist is and exactly what they did, is what the narcissist takes with them when the super empath leaves. Not the super empath's presence, not their warmth or their depth or their extraordinary capacity to make someone feel known in a way that nothing else compares to. What they take is the knowledge that someone saw them all the way through, past the charm and the construction and the carefully maintained false self, past the love bombing and the gaslighting and the narrative control, all the way down to what was actually there. And what was actually there was seen clearly, held accurately, understood completely, and still found insufficient, still found worth leaving. The narcissist has been rejected before. They have been left before, but they have almost never been seen before. Not like this, not with this quality of accuracy. And the rejection that comes from being fully seen and still not chosen operates on a completely different level than any rejection they have previously experienced. It does not just sting the ego in the familiar way that previous endings stung it. It penetrates something deeper, something the narcissist has spent their entire life building elaborate structures to protect. The terrifying, never examined, always defended core question of whether they are actually enough, whether there is something genuinely worth knowing underneath everything they perform. And the super empath's exit, carrying that clear-eyed verdict with them, answers that question in a way that the narcissist cannot argue with, cannot reframe successfully, cannot spin into something more comfortable, because the super empath saw too much, too clearly for the spin to stick, even in the narcissist's own internal narrative. This is where the inability to recover actually begins, and honestly, what comes next is the part most people completely miss. Because every coping mechanism a narcissist has ever successfully deployed in the aftermath of a relationship ending requires a certain amount of narrative flexibility, requires that the story of what happened can be shaped at least partially into something that reflects well on them, or at least neutrally. But the super empath leaves with the real story, not a bitter, exaggerated, emotionally reactive version of the story, the accurate version. And the narcissist knows it is accurate, which is the part that makes it impossible to dismiss entirely. Even in private, even in the moments when no one else is watching and the performance of being fine is temporarily switched off, in those moments, the knowledge that someone understood exactly what they were doing and chose to leave it anyway arrives without the cushioning that denial usually provides. Because the super empath's clarity does not leave room for the narcissist to convince even themselves that it was a misunderstanding, that they were misread, that if the super empath had just seen them differently, the outcome would have been different. The super empath saw them correctly. The outcome reflects that. And the narcissist, alone with that reality in the quiet moments they cannot fill with distraction, finds something there that they have no established method for processing. What they find and what it does to every relationship they attempt to build after this one, and why the pattern that has always reliably rebuilt their ego after previous relationships fails to fully work this time, that is the story that explains everything. What they find in those quiet moments that the narcissist works harder than almost anyone realizes to never have to sit inside is something that does not have a comfortable name in the vocabulary of someone who has spent their entire life avoiding self-examination. It is not guilt in the way a person with a fully developed conscience experiences guilt, with its accompanying impulse toward accountability, toward repair, toward the genuine desire to have been different. It is something more disorienting than guilt, and in many ways more corrosive, because it is closer to recognition. A recognition that arrives without the machinery of empathy that would allow them to process it constructively, without the self-awareness that would allow them to do something useful with it, without the emotional tools that would allow them to integrate it into a coherent understanding of who they are and what they need to change. It arrives as a raw, unprocessed knowing that sits in the center of them with nowhere to go. The knowing that the one person who understood them completely, not the performed version, not the charming version, not the version constructed to elicit admiration and supply, the one person who saw all the way down to what was actually there, decided that what was actually there was not something they could stay for. And unlike every previous person who left, the super empath cannot be dismissed as someone who simply did not understand them well enough. The super empath understood them better than anyone. That was the whole problem. That is the whole problem that does not go away. And what the narcissist does next is where it gets truly fascinating. So what does the narcissist do with this? Because a narcissist without a coping strategy is not something that happens. They will always reach for something, always find some mechanism for managing what cannot be integrated. The first thing they reach for is replacement, which is what they always reach for first. The familiar logic that the ache of one person's absence can be resolved by the presence of another, and they find someone usually quickly because the narcissist's ability to attract people has not diminished. The charm still works. The love bombing still lands. The initial phase of a new relationship still produces the hit of admiration and attention that temporarily quiets the noise. And for a while, maybe a few weeks, maybe a few months, the replacement strategy appears to be working the way it always has. They feel the familiar forward momentum of a new dynamic, the relief of having supply again, the comfortable reset that a fresh start with a new person has always provided before. But something is different this time, underneath the surface of the new relationship, in the private experience of the narcissist. When the newness quiets enough for comparison to become possible, the new person does not see them the way the super empath saw them. And somehow, despite the fact that being seen that clearly was ultimately what exposed them and contributed to their undoing, the absence of it in the new relationship creates a flatness they were not prepared for. A low-grade dissatisfaction that sits underneath the supply like static underneath music, always present, always slightly ruining the experience, impossible to fully tune out. This is the specific trap that the betrayed super empath leaves the narcissist in. And it is not something the super empath designed or intended or is sitting somewhere orchestrating with satisfaction. It is simply the natural consequence of having been a certain quality of presence in someone's life. Because the super empath, for all the pain of the relationship, for all the ways the dynamic was broken and the cost was borne almost entirely by them, also gave the narcissist something they have received from no one else and will receive from no one else in quite the same way. The experience of being genuinely, deeply, accurately known. Not flattered, not idealized, not performing for an audience that only sees the surface. Actually known. And that experience, even in the hands of someone who exploited it and weaponized it and ultimately could not tolerate the accountability it implied, leaves a mark. Because the human need to be known is not exclusive to people with healthy psychologies. The narcissist has it too, buried under layers of defense and performance and the elaborate false self constructed to protect the wound underneath. They have it, and they have almost never had it met because the kind of knowing the super empath brought to the relationship requires the person being known to be willing to be seen. And the narcissist has spent their entire life engineering the opposite of that, except with the super empath, somehow, briefly, imperfectly, terrifyingly, they were seen anyway. And now that it is gone, the absence of it is louder than they expected, louder than anything the new supply can drown out. Here is where the inability to recover moves from being about the loss of the super empath specifically into being about something the narcissist carries into everything that comes after. Because the recognition that arrived in the quiet moments, the raw, unprocessed knowing about themselves that the super empath's clear-eyed exit deposited somewhere they cannot reach to remove it, starts doing something the narcissist has no framework for managing. It starts contaminating the performance. Not visibly, not in ways that are immediately obvious to new people who do not have the context to notice the difference, but in small, private ways that the narcissist registers with a discomfort they cannot name. The love bombing feels slightly more mechanical than it used to. The construction of the false self requires slightly more effort than it used to. The moments after a successful manipulation, which used to produce a clean hit of satisfaction, now produce something slightly murkier, not quite guilt, but adjacent to it. Something that asks a question the narcissist has no interest in answering but cannot entirely silence. The super empath's clarity carried out of the relationship in her understanding of exactly what he was doing and how and why has somehow lodged itself inside his own experience of doing it. She saw the mechanism, and now, because she saw it so completely and so accurately, he cannot fully unsee it from the inside. The trick does not work as cleanly when some part of you is now aware, against your will, that it is a trick. This is psychological territory that the narcissist has never occupied before and has no map for. Every previous relationship they left or ended or destroyed gave them at minimum the intact ability to move forward as themselves. The performed self, the constructed self, the self that has been working reliably in the world for as long as they can remember. The super empath's betrayal, meaning the narcissist's betrayal of the super empath, has compromised that ability in a way they cannot fully repair, not destroyed it. A narcissist's defenses are formidable and the false self is resilient and the capacity for denial runs deep and wide but compromised, slightly cracked. And a crack in the foundation of a structure built entirely on performance is not a small thing. It is the place where the whole architecture becomes for the first time slightly untrustworthy, slightly unreliable, slightly less certain to hold under the weight it was built to carry. And what this ultimately produces in the narcissist, who will never admit it and may never even fully consciously recognize it, is a haunting. Not in the dramatic, gothic sense of the word, but in the quiet, persistent, psychological sense. The presence of something in the background of everything they do that was not there before. The super empath haunts them not because she was perfect, or because the relationship was genuinely healthy, or because what they had together was the love story the narcissist may sometimes rewrite it as in memory. She haunts them because she was real. Because in a life built almost entirely on surfaces and performances and the management of other people's perceptions, she represented something that could not be managed. A genuine encounter with someone who would not be fooled, who could not be permanently deceived, who absorbed everything he brought and eventually, quietly, clearly handed it back to him with her departure and said, "I see exactly what this is, and I choose better than this for myself." That moment of being chosen against, not from confusion or hurt or a failure to understand what he was, but from a complete and accurate understanding of exactly what he was, is the moment the narcissist cannot move past, cannot fully process, cannot spin into something that restores what it took from them, because what it took was not just her presence. It was the last remaining ability to fully believe their own performance. And without that recovery, real recovery, to the version of themselves that existed before she saw through it, is not something that is coming. It is something that was permanently, quietly, and irrevocably foreclosed the moment she walked out carrying the truth of them more clearly than they have ever been able to carry it themselves.